Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Ziv from Elementor and I'm really excited to host this special conversation in honor of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Today we're talking about something that affects all of us, accessibility. What it means, why it matters, and how we move from just raising awareness to taking real action. Joining me is Breandan Ward. He's an accessibility advocate and consultant whose personal journey from investment banking in London to coaching and consulting has shaped a powerful perspective on inclusion, digital equity, and resilience. We're going to talk about milestones from his life, key challenges that he's faced, and what all of us can do to build a more accessible world online and off. Let's dive in. To kick things off, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background and what brought you into the world of accessibility and advocacy?
Hello, everyone. Well, you can probably tell from my accent as you hear me speak that I'm very Irish sounding, and that is because I'm Irish. In fact, 100% Irish, but not 100% sighted. So I have this genetic condition. It runs in our family. One of my brothers and I both have this condition, which is causing our sight to get worse very slowly, but very surely over time. So up till the age of about 22, 23, I didn't know what accessibility was. Did I even care? I was getting on with life and study and my first job. But when I had that diagnosis, which was early on in my career, like in the first few years, I started to notice challenges with seeing, with my reading vision. And that's when the long journey, let's say, of diagnosis and figuring out what was going on started for me. So that's really the point where I went from being quote unquote mainstream anybody to suddenly someone who realized my body was changing, not in ways that I wanted or chose, but it very much put this question of accessibility right into the heart of my life. So yeah, originally I started out in investment banking, so that was my first job out of university. I grew up and
Let's talk about a pivotal moment. Your first job in investment banking in London. What barriers did you encounter back then related to your sight loss? And how did that impact your work and perspective at the time?
yeah, so the early years, classic first job out of university was working in finance, in banking, and that was quite an intense industry, and it still is quite an intense industry. So it means you're learning a lot, you're working long hours, you're meeting lots of different people, and in those early, I'd say, year or two of work, things worked fine. The systems worked fine for me. My eyes were working fine. So this kind of interaction between me and the environment didn't really have any specific barriers other than the usual ones around, you're learning, you're starting to figure things out. There's those sort of barriers that you encounter in any new job or in any new career. Uh, what changed for me, though, and this is going back to 2002, 2003, is that my eyes started to change. So over the space of a few months, nothing had changed in my environment. It was still the same systems. It was still the same employer. I still had the same colleagues. And yet, because of what was changing in my eyes, suddenly there was a new kind of an experience, which is the experience of a barrier. What is it like to come to your day job and to suddenly discover that the technology you're using, so in my case, it was a PC, part of a firm-wide system, lots of different internal software. What happens when you suddenly encounter barriers in the digital space, in the technological space? And for me, looking back now, I actually realize that disability is more than just the diagnosis I got. It's actually this interaction. It's the place of interaction between, in that case, my eyes that were changing and the environment around me. And so looking back on that period of time, it was hard. It was hard to suddenly encounter these barriers. And the other thing I wanted to mention about disability, many people think of it as a diagnosis. Many people think of disability as the thing that's written on the letter from your consultant. So in my case, I had a report from the consultant at the eye hospital in London, Moorfields. It's a very prestigious and well-known eye hospital. They're really the experts. And I left those, sessions or appointments, let's say, with something written on my report, which essentially said, look, I have a diagnosis. And for many years, I thought that was disability. I thought that those words, progressive sight loss, visual impairment, partial sight, I thought those words were the disability. But looking back 20 years on from that, I see something very different, and that is disability was actually the interaction of three things: the body, in my case, my eyes, that was changing, the environment around me, and what barriers came up when I suddenly found systems and technology and the digital world not accessible, and also the rest of me, the rest of my background. So growing up in Ireland, being raised Catholic, I certainly felt lots of guilt about this situation. I felt a good degree of shame and guilt and denial about the whole thing. And I think that cultural influence also affected my response. So looking back from now, it's far more than just a diagnosis or a label. For me, I've learned that disability is actually an interaction of these three things. And I think of them like the three Bs, our bodies and minds, the barriers we encounter in our environment, and the background, the rest of who we are.
Later on, you moved to New York City and pursued studies at NYU. How did your experience of accessibility differ in the US compared to the UK? And what new challenges or insights did that period bring?
Yes, after 10 years in London, I moved with my job to New York. And, I want to give two examples or two small stories that really illustrate the difference. Of course, two different countries, two different cultures. And for me, going through that process of, workplace accommodation and interacting not just in work, but outside of work and finding my way, it was very interesting to notice how two big cities like London and New York were actually quite different in many ways. And I'll give you one example of a London story that really stuck with me. It was probably one of the most impactful things that ever happened to me in London, in my job, in a specific work setting and to do with technology. So I was working in the bank one day, a few years after I had my diagnosis, and I got some reasonable accommodations in the form of, many of your audience today will know about Zoom Text or JAWS or any of the screen reader technologies. So, I got set up with Zoom Text, which meant I could magnify my screen, I could listen to the screen reader, and that was really helpful. My boss came up to me one day and said to me, Breandan, do you think a larger screen, like the largest possible computer screen, would be helpful? And I said, I was kind of shocked by this approach. He meant it very sort of in a very kind way, in a very kind of positive way, not at all sort of negative or critical. And I hesitated because I had never really been asked that kind of question, because, what he was really asking me was, Breandan, what can I do to make this job as accessible as possible for you? And, I hesitated. There was my barrier, my hesitation, my reluctance, and he was opening the door to new ways of working, better ways, more efficient ways of working, simply by offering me a larger screen. When you're zooming in on your screen, as any folks watching will know, it's you have to look closer at your screen. It's kind of harder work. It's a bit exhausting. And I've found with trying out a much larger screen, it actually made my work a lot easier. So, in that case, where was the barrier? It wasn't the technology. It wasn't my employer. It wasn't my boss. It was actually me and my hesitation, So I just give that example because when I think about disability, and many of the folks watching today, given the day we're celebrating, will know about the social model of disability. So this is where the burden is placed not on those of us with disability to make things accessible, but actually the burden falls to systems and all of us, to make the world as accessible as possible, both the physical and the digital world. And that boss in that conversation was a brilliant example of the social model in action. He was asking what he could do, what the employer could do to make my job as accessible as possible. And I'll contrast that story with something I noticed when I lived in the US for 7 years altogether. I was there initially in the bank, and then eventually I left to pursue studies at NYU. And I noticed quite a big cultural difference. And folks in the US might identify with this, or people who've been to the US might identify with it. There's a very strong emphasis in the US on raising your voice and being self-reliant and being independent. That individual focus is very strong in US culture, and it has really positive effects. It's one of the reasons I think we've had a lot of the disability rights progress that we've had, because people literally take companies to court, they sue. There's a huge focus on individual rights, which has really helped us all around the world in, how we learn from the US and how we improve rights in general for people, disabled and otherwise. But, there's a downside to it too, which I experienced and I felt it, which is it is kind of exhausting to be always on the hook for your own advocacy. And that's one of the downsides of hyper individualism. If it's always up to the person with a disability to speak up and to ask and to protest and to inquire, it becomes a kind of a tax on disability from my perspective. Not only am I losing my sight, I also have to find the energy to continuously ask for things that I need. And that, for me, is actually not the social model in action. If the burden falls to people with disabilities to ask for a more accessible website, or to ask for a WordPress toolkit that's more accessible, or to ask a business to make things, products and services, more accessible and usable, that to me is not the social model. That actually puts the burden back on people with disabilities. So I just contrast those stories, not to say that one country is better than another, but just to share this perspective that, when we think about the social model of disability, and if we believe in the social model of disability, it means that we take responsibility to lift the burden off customers, consumers, employees, colleagues. We take a active role in helping make things more accessible and doing it more proactively, not waiting on customers to complain, not waiting on lawsuits, not waiting on all these things that actually they can work, but I feel they're not really the social model in action.
You then returned to the UK, pivoted into coaching and consulting, and then came COVID-19. What changed for you during that time in terms of accessibility barriers and opportunities, and how did you adapt?
COVID-19 was very interesting. So I'd already moved back from the US. I wanted to be closer to my folks who were in Ireland. And I had this decision to make, as many people will have who've moved around. At what point do you kind of decide, right, here is going to be home? So I did want to move back to London. I transitioned into training as a coach. So I'm a leadership coach. That's one of my jobs, as well as advising various startups in the assistive technology space. And COVID-19 was interesting because, again, thinking about barriers, I couldn't believe how lucky I was. I went back to my folks in Ireland. I was on the farm. So fortunately, we were safe. Fortunately, we were in a lovely sort of natural environment, right, on farmland in lovely sunny days, away from that very stressful experience for folks who were in cities. And many of the folks joining today will have been in that very tough place, exposed to COVID, impacted personally and in their families. So while there was all of this really horrible thing going on, I felt from a disabled person perspective that suddenly I had the same barriers as everyone else. And that wasn't always true before. Of course, everyone could go do what they want, work where they want, travel where they want. Before COVID, before the lockdowns, those of us with disabilities obviously experienced barriers, but everyone else, we thought, had far less barriers to deal with. And suddenly the lockdown had this it kind of leveled the playing field. Suddenly everyone was locked down. Suddenly everyone had barriers. And I don't want to say I enjoyed that. It just changed my confidence a lot. I realized that now everyone is having an experience of barriers, whether it's having to work from home and struggling with digital accessibility. I heard loads of people who were perfectly sighted struggling with technology during this time. Those were barriers, not being able to get out and about and to socialize and to do all the things we love doing. Those were barriers, So it really leveled the playing field. And I found in a strange way that my own sense of myself and my own confidence increased because I felt more of an equal. Um, and then, of course, after the lockdowns ended, thankfully, and we seem to have emerged from that period, it's interesting how things have changed because for many people with disabilities, it's actually been quite hard. It's been quite hard to come back to the world of inequality where, we're still left with the barriers we always had, whereas everyone else is now more or less free to resume life as normal. So, it's interesting when you think about barriers. Barriers can arise for all of us in any situation. And one of my good friends, colleagues, talks about the fact that disability is all of us some of the time and some of us all of the time. And that really helps me understand this question of disability and accessibility, which is, if there's one thing we've learned from COVID-19, it's that we can all lose access quite quickly and quite easily. And rather than being sort of a peripheral thing or a sideshow, when employers or companies think about accessibility, it's actually a mainstream topic, and this is one of the reasons while I was at NYU, I advocated for a mainstream class on disability. And this is something I've been teaching for the last 5 years, and I go back for 2 weeks each spring. It's really to bring this topic of accessibility into the mainstream. So it isn't just a specialization, but that everyone gets a chance to think about it, to consider the implications of access and lack of access, and that we actually see it under the social model, as part of our professional responsibility, not something for, the team in the corner to look after when they have budget and time, but actually integrate it as part of the mainstream. And that's something that I feel COVID's helped to highlight, is that access is not a peripheral issue. It's actually a mainstream issue.
We already have Global Accessibility Awareness Day to raise awareness, but why isn't that enough?
Well, awareness is really important, but it's not the only thing. I think about this expression in Hebrew, lo hamidrash ha'ikar ela el ma'aseh, it's not just the kind of teaching and talking and telling that matters, it's also the doing. And so I wrestle a bit with this every year, we have one Global Accessibility Awareness Day every year. Shouldn't that be every day? And then I've realized and come to peace with the fact that, maybe once a year we do need this big reminder so that the rest of the year we can spend on action, So what do I mean by action? Well, it's one thing for companies and us as individuals to talk about being committed to inclusion and committed to access. It's a very different thing to actually demonstrate it. So I imagine, the old-fashioned shop. Remember, there used to be a thing called a physical store that you could go in and buy stuff. They're sadly less common now that we have a lot of online selling. But imagine going to your local town and seeing a store that has a big sign on the front of it saying, we welcome all customers and we're inclusive and, we want everyone to feel welcome. Please come in. And you go to the door and the door is closed or locked or it won't open. Imagine how ridiculous that is for a company, a seller, to have these big statements about inclusion and access and customer service. But actually, when the customer goes to access the store to buy something, they can't actually access the store. It's ridiculous. So in the digital world, when I think about accessibility awareness, of course, we need to educate ourselves. And that's what today is all about, growing our awareness of access. And for me, how global it is, not just worldwide global, but global in the sense that it involves all of us. It's actually all of us. There isn't them and us in the world of accessibility. There's just us. And so for me, raising awareness is important. It's a hugely important day that Jennison and colleagues set up many years ago that we celebrate each year. However, it's only going to make a difference if we go and figure out in what way is our door actually closed and locked? Like, in what way do we need to identify and remove barriers in the physical space, in the digital space? And if we do identify and remove those barriers, for example, if our website's not accessible and we go and do the hard work, not just to do that audit or that scan of the website, but actually to keep on top of it every day. Websites are complex, they're dynamic. It's not enough just to do a once-off and put an overlay on a website. We have to actually have a method for constantly reviewing it and keeping that door open, because then we can at least say we have made the social model a reality. We have made our online presence or our physical store as accessible as possible. And hopefully that means more customers and more business and more profitability and happier customers, more inclusion. It's a win-win.
Let's talk about responsibility. Whose job is it to make the physical and the digital world more accessible?
There's a really interesting question. Going back to my stories from earlier about differences I've noticed in different countries, I feel that responsibility is shared. In an ideal world, of course, every time I go somewhere as someone who's partially sighted, things should be accessible. But no system's perfect. There's no such thing as perfection. So I feel very responsible for raising my voice. And I feel all of us in the community of people with disabilities or neurodivergence or health conditions, we all have a responsibility to raise our voice. And we all have a responsibility as employers, as companies, as charities, as governments, to make sure that we're creating the conditions for access, right? And sitting around waiting on disabled people to ask is not what I call creating conditions. So I think it's actually both of us. And I think that if either side, I don't want to think about us being opposite sides, but let's just take for a moment the folks who need access at any point in time. If it's always left to us, that actually makes us tired and angry. And eventually, I don't think it comes to a good place for us. I mean, we have better things to do with our time than constantly pushing for basic access. On the flip side, if the employers and companies are always getting it right, which is impossible, it kind of makes us a bit passive. There's a kind of a risk that, let's say, a company might start to presume things and might start to say, oh yeah, we can figure all this stuff. We don't need to talk to people with disabilities. So I actually feel that in extreme, putting all the responsibility on disabled people is not a good thing. Putting all the responsibility on everyone else may also not be a good thing. And so I feel it really is a shared responsibility that we need to create the conditions, and that responsibility falls to employers, companies, businesses, governments, as well as those of us with access needs to speak up and ask for what we need.
In your experience, what are the real-world consequences of getting accessibility right? And what does success look like for businesses, teams, and customers?
Actually, a story I'll share. One of my I work with some different startups, and I'm really interested in entrepreneurship as a topic. So one of the folks I know who runs a business around wayfinding, got a call one day from one of the companies he'd signed up years prior, and the boss of the company said, why am I paying for this wayfinding thing? Like, no one ever comes, or no one will ever come. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, prove to me that I should be doing it. And it's such an illogical argument when you think, I can understand why people might get to that line of argument, but it doesn't make sense, because it goes back to this. Imagine you're a business and your doors are closed to some customers. Like, the argument that says, look, they're just not here. I don't have people with disabilities on my website, or I don't have people with disabilities in my physical store. Well, maybe that's because it's not accessible, So the reason why there aren't blind or partially sighted people online buying from you is because your website's not accessible. If it was accessible, imagine what that experience is like for someone like me. Imagine how many people I will tell about this. Imagine how many of my family and friends will actually crowd in to also support that business, because they know the difference it makes for me. So I think the consequences are really extensive when we make the effort to make our websites and our physical spaces and our digital environment more accessible, because what it means is happier customers. And like, going back to the first principles of business, we're supposed to know our customers. So, if we think that folks with disabilities don't exist, or they're not going to buy from us, it means that we're actually forgetting about a huge segment of the market. And in what setting would that ever be allowed at a senior sort of business meeting? At what point would a business leader ever be forgiven for saying, we're actually ignoring part of the market? That's a valuable part of the market. We're actually not pursuing that bit of customer research, or we're not trying to sort of reach those customers who are ready to buy, So for me, it comes back to this mainstream part of accessibility. Disabled customers are customers, and very loyal customers, and very impactful in terms of how many people we can tell about your brand. And so the brand equity starts to get higher and higher. So for me, the consequences of doing it are very, very positive. And of course, the reverse is true, because imagine what I say about websites that I can't access, or about physical environments that I can't access. Like, imagine how many people I tell. Imagine what that does to the reputation of the organization. And I don't forget these things. People with disabilities, neurodivergence, even folks who are getting older and have their own access needs, which is so common in our aging population. Imagine how many people we tell about bad experiences, about inaccessible websites, inaccessible environments. So, for me, it's a no-brainer. Know your customer, invite the customer in, open the digital doors, and then you'd be surprised how positive that effect can be on your brand and on the reach of your brand.
On the flip side, what happens if we don't get it right? What's at stake for society and for individuals when accessibility is treated as an afterthought?
Well, accessibility is an afterthought. It's a bit like my class at NYU, and what happens when we think of accessibility as kind of this specialization off to the side. Let's wear a t-shirt once a year and run around saying we love accessibility. Like, in the end, we're missing the business impact. I've talked about that already, but also this actually has a huge influence on the general well-being of people, you know what I mean? So when businesses talk about giving back, this is actually a way you can give back directly in your business approach, which is that you're actually creating an experience that's positive for customers, and the impact that has on their day, their week, their journey. So, we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We think about all these different things that we need to do as a global family. Making people feel welcome, making them feel a sense of belonging and a sense of worthiness is actually very possible through business. And so I think the consequences of not doing it, it just adds to this distrust that's out there, this sense of alienation that people feel. I mean, this is true of any customers who have bad experiences. So, I think in this day and age, when there's so many challenges around in the environment, when you turn on the news, when you talk to friends and family, there's lots of challenges. And what we actually need is bright spots. We need lights that shine brightly with the counter narrative. And so every time you open your business online or in person, and you are hearing the needs of your customers and you're meeting the needs of your customers, you're not just doing good business, you're actually making a big impact to that quality of life for the person, the customers you're dealing with. So I wouldn't underestimate as a business the power that you have to make people's lives better and to make an alternative possible. That not everything is about distrust, not everything is about separation and disconnection and negativity. There are actually lots of businesses doing great work to meet their customers, hear their customers, deliver products and services, either in the physical or digital space. And that's a really good news story. And we need these good news stories because it's good for business, but it's also good for society.
Before we close, is there one piece of advice you'd give to web creators or companies just starting to prioritize accessibility in their work?
Yes, I would say this: never forget that you are creating the conditions, not just for people to feel more included, but you're creating the conditions for better business results, right? Because you're reaching customers where they're at. So don't ever feel that it's some kind of sideshow. Don't ever feel that it's sort of incidental and not important. You're actually doing the most vital work to bring the kind of edge cases into the mainstream, into the center. And that's a way of doing good and doing well. So you might feel sometimes it's a headache. Of course, all of the different web accessibility guidelines, they're very technical. Like, there's a lot there. Then there's a lot of pressure. There's the threat of lawsuits. There's compliance. There's customers that might sue. If you're thinking about this in a mainstream way, if you're thinking about it not just as ticking the box, but actually as a way to get to know your customers, to make your business more accessible, to open the digital doors, imagine what difference that can make to your brand and to the customers that go through the door. Imagine what difference it makes for you when you go home at night thinking, wow, I've just raised the game of this business. I've just met the needs of so many more customers. This is mainstream work and it's vital work. So keep going.
That was incredibly insightful. Thank you so much, Breandan, for sharing your story and your perspective with us today. Accessibility isn't just a checkbox. It's about creating experiences that work for everyone and that takes awareness, intention, and action. If you're a web creator, designer, or business owner, I hope this conversation inspired you to see accessibility as a creative opportunity, not a limitation. And if you're using WordPress, we invite you to explore Ally, our new accessibility solution built to help you create more inclusive websites effortlessly. Thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned. This is just the beginning. We'll be sharing more conversations and initiatives to help make the world more accessible for everyone. Ciao for now.